In this sequence of videos, we're going to do two things. First, we'll learn a little bit about how perceiving works. Second, we'll use what we've learned about how perceiving works to draw some conclusions about reasoning. This is important for epistemology for several reasons. One is that perceiving is a way we form beliefs. And this raises the question, is it a good way to form beliefs or not? I think it is a good way to form beliefs. I think beliefs formed on the basis of perceiving are generally justified and generally provide knowledge. But it's important to understand how perceiving works when you're deciding whether beliefs formed on the basis of perceiving are justified and whether they can provide knowledge. Learning about perceiving, how perceiving affects how we should think about reasoning, shows that scientific discoveries about perceiving can constrain philosophical theorizing about, for example, the value of various kinds of reasoning. And more generally, this shows that although science observation never implies philosophical theories, it can help us choose among various philosophical theories in less direct ways. Okay, so let's begin by talking a little bit about how perceiving works. So here you have a soccer ball out in the world, and I'm just going to use this as a running example. I want you to imagine that you're seeing this soccer ball sitting in green grass. Now, there's two very different stories we could tell about how seeing this soccer ball works. We'll start with a story that we might call seeing as absorbing, and we'll begin to illuminate this story with an analogy. So here's the analogy. We have our soccer ball in the world, and we're going to take a picture of it using an analog camera. The shutter opens for a moment that lets light in. Different surfaces reflect different wavelengths of light. So the grass reflects mostly green light. The white parts of the ball reflect all kinds of light, or much of every wavelength of light, meaning white light enters the camera from there. And the black surfaces reflect very little light, so we can think of it as black light. That's not quite right. It's just very few wavelengths reflecting off that surface, entering the ball. This leads to an imprint on the film in the back of the camera. That is, the film is photosensitive, so it absorbs light. How it reacts to the absorbed light depends on the wavelength. The light it absorbs depends on the wavelength of that light, as well as the intensity of that light. And you end up with an image, a photonegative. This isn't actually a photonegative, but you end up with a sort of photonegative of the image in the world. That just means the colors are kind of backwards. You then have a darkroom over here. And what's going to happen is somebody's going to take that film and bring it into the darkroom. And when they bring it in, they'll have to block it from all light and put it through a chemical wash that makes the film no longer photosensitive, so light won't impact it at all. The photographer then takes this over and sticks the negative in a machine which shines light directly through it. That light strikes photosensitive paper, which then absorbs the light. The photographer then takes that photosensitive paper and puts it in a chemical bath, which reacts with the paper in various ways. It reacts differently depending on what kind of light has been absorbed at any given point. And eventually it will go through a wash where an image will appear on the film, on the paper. And the image will more or less match what was on the film, which more or less is determined by the light the camera absorbed that went through the lens, which more or less is determined by the light reflected by the objects in the world. So there's kind of a direct translation from the world to the image you end up with here. The final stage, the photographer will take this image on the paper, put it through a final wash so the paper is no longer at all photosensitive, and then hang it on the wall to dry, and you have a print. Now, let's suppose that seeing works more or less this way. So you have an object in the world, your eye absorbs light through its lens, just like the camera absorbs light through its lens. Just like there's there's film on the back of the camera that absorbs the light, there's a retina on the back of your eye that absorbs the light. Then, just as in the darkroom, the person just takes that film and tries to sort of preserve what's there on the film in order to make a print. Your brain tries to preserve what's there in the retinal image in order to make a visual experience. So if seeing is like this, then what happens in your brain merely preserves what's already present in the retinal image. The brain's job is sort of not to screw things up. So here's a passage explaining this. On this analogy, your eyes are in the center. That is, the analogy centers on your eyes. It explains how they emit, focus, and absorb light, creating the retinal image. The analogy explains how that image includes everything you see, how your brain merely copies that image, changing its format into a visual experience. A story based on this analogy would read like a technical manual for a camera. Not much drama, not much intrigue. We could title this story Seeing as Absorbing. The title is fitting because the main act features your retinas absorbing light. It's also fitting because the story treats seeing as simply absorbing what's ever there when you open your eyes, simply taking in the world. Your brain is a minor character, a mere scribe, who copies the signal from your eyes into a new format. Now let's look at a different story. This story will center on a different analogy. So we're once again going to begin with an analog camera, but we're going to suppose this time that when the film absorbs the light, it kind of degrades it. It doesn't capture this perfectly. It's not a perfect representation. It's a degraded representation. And then when the photographer brings the film into the room and puts it through the chemical wash so that the film will no longer be sensitive to light, it degrades things even further. I didn't depict the further degradation, but you can get the idea. Then when the photographer shines light through this onto photosensitive paper, it degrades things even further. Maybe some colors change, the image blurs further, and so on and so forth. And then we can suppose that each wash blurs things further, until you end up with a print that's a far cry from what's in the world. Again, I didn't depict the increasing levels of misrepresentation, the increasing levels of degradation, but we can suppose that they're there. Okay, now if this is how photography works, when the photographer gets this print, she's not going to be satisfied. She's not going to say, okay, that's what the world was like. Instead, she's going to say, that doesn't look right. Now I need to do something. I need to paint over top of this image until it seems right. I can use this as kind of a rough idea, telling me roughly where the ball and the grass were, roughly what colors things were, but I need to use also my memory and every clue I can, my expectations about what soccer balls look like, what grass looks like, and so on and so forth, to fix this up until it looks like what I expect the scene looked like. Okay, so suppose seeing is like this. Then by analogy, we start the same way. Light enters your eye, your retina absorbs that light, but everything gets degraded by the time it gets to your brain. The resulting image that your brain would give to you would make your visual experience just seems wrong to your brain, so your brain thinks, that doesn't look right. Now I need to change it until it seems right. Your brain then uses its expectations about soccer balls, about scenes like this, its memories, and so on and so forth, to fill in gaps, to fix up colors, to make boundaries more solid, more clear, and so on, until it ends up creating a visual experience that, if all goes well, matches the world. Now, if this is how things work, your brain is very active. It's not passive. It's not a mere scribe that takes down how things were and sort of puts them in a format you can use. It's rather more like a detective who investigates the world, trying to figure out what was there and trying to guess at what things were like in order to create an image, a visual experience that fits with the world. So if seeing is like this, then what happens in your brain does more than preserve what's already there in the retinal image. On this analogy, we start the same way, talking about your eyes, but then things change. The analogy explains how the signal from your eyes is degraded, how your brain identifies the most probable cause out there in the world of that degraded signal, and how your brain makes you see whatever it takes to be there, whatever it supposes is most probable. A story about seeing that's based on this analogy would read like a mystery. Your brain would be like a detective, using every clue it can to try and figure out what out there in the world caused the input that it receives from your eyes. What should we title this second story? Well, to presume is to suppose that whatever is most probable is true. That's just the definition of presume. In this story, that's how seeing works. Your brain identifies the most probable cause out there in the world of the signal it gets from your eyes. It then constructs a visual experience to match what it supposes is out there. Far from being a mere copy of the retinal image, your visual experience is your brain's best guess, its supposition based on probability, its presumption about what's out there. Accordingly, the title of this story should be Seeing is Presuming. Which of these stories is more accurate? Which is closer to how seeing actually works? We'll consider that question in the next video.